Today we have Nick Hasson with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Hasson, colorist. He's the first non-DP on this podcast. Nick, how are you?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being the first non-cinematographer.
Yeah, we thought that we should start listening to people that are not DPs but are absolutely involved in the cinematography. And I am lucky enough to have been working with Nick for a while and to have Nick as a friend too. So call him, and he's here with us.
Here we are. Yeah, we've been
There
lucky
we
to
go.
do 6 or 7 projects, I think, together now.
Yeah,
What was the first
Across
one? Do you guys remember?
El Chicano.
El
El
Chicano, yeah.
Chicano.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that was our first one. That's where we met, which was great because it came in with so much style and Wami's always so great with his work. The lighting and the lensing always comes in where it should be, which is always great. It's always nice.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
The
bottom line, he saved my butt with that movie, and then we keep working together.
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, every production has its challenges, right? No
Yeah,
matter how much money, no matter how much prep, there's always something that has to be rushed and fixed later. So, but that's what
exactly.
post is for. It's for those things that you can't get right, right?
Yeah.
Coming
Or
later.
or as a sweetener for the things you know. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know you want to go a certain direction, so it's like I'm sure you've worked on both spectrums, right? Where you get brought in early to build the LUT, and you're in the conversations, you read the script, and then sometimes where it's just like, I got this thing, help me.
yeah. And it's always tough. It's so much better to be involved early. Like Wami and I have had the luck the last few movies we've done that we've talked about it and made some LUTs and done some looks, and that's always great because everyone always gets offline love, and so it's great to try to get the image as close to the final as possible, out of the camera so that everyone gets used to that. And then this way, when they come in the DI bay, we're just enhancing things. We're just taking that, last step and making it better and not changing it from, some place far left to far right. That's always tough with the director because they get so used to watching, dailies, and it's one of the things why dailies is so important that people forget about. It's like, we all think of dailies as like this throwaway thing, right? It's just this temp thing that we're going to edit with, but that's what everybody gets used to the look on a project. And so if the dailies are bad, sometimes people fall in love with something that's bad.
Oh yeah.
And even when you show them something good, they get so used to it. And some directors have a hard time with that. And most directors, I think, they settle in. They have that first initial shock, and then they evaluate it and compare and go back, and then they kind of come back and go, okay, I see what you guys are doing. It makes sense. It follows the story. But that's always the biggest thing to me, is just following the story, like what works best.
How
Because
many?
there's
Yeah.
always this thing with cinematography where people want the best looking image, which I totally get, but sometimes the best looking image isn't the best thing for the story either.
Uh,
Sometimes you need it to be mucky and ugly and not perfect.
I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah.
How
We talk
many?
about that all the time.
How many times have you heard from a director going to the room and going, "Oh my God, this is not what I imagined. It's too dark." It's
yeah.
like,
Well, we always like dark, right? Like
yes.
we always like it dark, but the producers are usually the hard ones with that. The directors kind of settle in, right?
Yeah.
The producers are always like, I paid a lot of money for that thing in the background, why is it not visible?
Yeah. Well, like you
I
said,
find
appropriateness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I love watching European television and European films, because I feel like they have such a different aesthetic that I learned from that. And there seems to be a thing too where like they let characters live in the dark, and it's feel like it's such maybe more of a television thing in America where we have to see every emotion in the eyes all the time,
Mm.
and that sometimes creates, I think, what people refer to as like that Netflix look, that's kind of like a wash of just flat brightness. I like it when characters, I mean, you look at old cinema and what we all fell in love with. It was bold, it was brave, it was fun.
So,
Completely.
Nick, for people who doesn't exactly know what a colorist does, what is what you do in a movie?
Yeah. So if we'll start from the beginning. So if I'm involved early, what we'll do is we'll talk about the look of the movie, what we want it to look like. We'll often have references of what we're doing, what the shadows, how heavy the shadows, how heavy are the contrast, how much color, how much less color. And so we'll start with just defining the world that we want the movie to be in, and we'll take some images, usually some camera tests, and we'll kind of create that world and create a couple different variations of that. And we'll start there. So the colorist will start there, helping the cinematographer, get that look. So that's why I kind of feel like colorists are somewhat an extension of the camera department. We're an extra tool and an extra eye for your cinematography. So that would happen. We would make a LUT, go out to set. Sometimes, like Wami and I have made adjustments on those LUTs the first day or two, depending on once you get in that real world. A lot of times we're doing it with hair and makeup tests, which isn't always the the perfect thing. We've had a couple movies where I think we've actually gotten to shoot on the actual set for the hair and makeup test, which is great because then you know exactly what everything's going to look like. So we may make some adjustments in dailies for the first couple of days to get what they need, and then usually everyone after the first week, I kind of disappear and I don't hear from anyone for weeks to months, depending on the length of the production, and then everyone goes into editing and they'll edit the movie, and then once the movie's done, editing, they'll come to me and we'll go back to all the original camera files. The way I work is we always work from the original source files. So if you shot a red file, we use a red file. If you shot a ARRI RAW, we use the ARRI RAW. Whatever you have goes into the Resolve or the Baselight. And then from there, the first thing to do is just take that look that we did and put that on the movie. And the first step is just to go through and make the continuity of the movie work. So put all the images next to each other that weren't shot next to each other. Now they're in this edit. Make them flow, make sure the contrast is right, and make sure everything's even. So that's kind of known as like a colorist first pass, where we just make the movie watchable and live in that world. And then usually what will happen is then at that point, like Wami would come in and him and I would just sit down and we would start looking at the images and start thinking like, where is the viewer's eye? Where do we need to direct their eye? And sometimes it's an overall color correction kind of breaks down into two segments. It's a primary grade, which is where we're kind of affecting the whole image, and then a secondary grade where we may just be affecting part of the image. So we may be brightening the faces a little bit or darkening the backgrounds or reducing lens flares or things like that. And then we'll tweak, when you make the look ahead of time, you'll end up tweaking the look a lot less in the final because you kind of got where you want. So from that point, then it's just like, what can we do to make things better? And, we'll go through and just start shot by shot, adjusting everything you need. Maybe the corners are too bright. Maybe, the shadow side of the face is a little too dark and we just want to bring it up so you can just see the eye. Or maybe the opposite, where we're like, we're seeing too much into the shadows. Let's take that shadow side down, and we'll do that. And then also, I think it's a big feel. How do things feel when you watch it? Does it feel like the world? Does it feel like the right movie? And then Wami and I, and then a lot of times we're always messing with textures as well, because we kind of want to give the image some texture. And him and I are both old film guys, so we love film. And so we play around with the level of grain. And we've done that many different ways, where sometimes it's just we find a one size that fits all and it really works well. And sometimes we'll have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different settings of grain, and we'll go in and sometimes change that based on emotional things in the story. So the story may start to get more tense and we'll put more grain in, just to kind of give that unsettling feeling and help people subconscious kind of stay in the story and see what they need. And so those are always fun. And then Wami always loves to give me day for night. We've done that a few times, which is super fun. So that's the far extreme probably of color correction, where we're taking something and radically changing it different. And the day for night stuff is sometimes really easy, and sometimes it's required a lot of roto. It kind of just depends on where you are, what the light is, and those are always the best challenges. Those are always the fun things where you're like, how are we going to approach this? And then I know the first time we did it, we thought, well, what day for night? Because there's so many different takes on day for night, and are we going blue? Are we leaning heavily blue? Or are we going to take out color? Or the director sometimes have opinions on that, and we find a place that everyone is kind of happy with it. And I think overall the colorist just takes that image, makes it consistent, helps the creative direction, and then I think just focuses on what the viewer is going to be looking at and helps direct the eye of what the viewer is looking at and where they're going. And then on top of that, now we have so many different delivery systems. So the other thing a colorist does will be making sure that the color is consistent between all the different deliverables. Like we may have Dolby Vision HDR, we have the SDR pass, then we have theatrical, and so that's another thing we do. Just keeping it so that no matter where you go, you will see relatively the same movie. You know, whether you're in HDR or you're in an IMAX screen. You know, we want to keep that world that we built for the movie as consistent as we can across all the technologies.
You mean that's not just AI?
Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. AI is coming, and I think I have a more positive outlook on AI. I really don't think that I will be replaced by an AI anytime soon. I think that I will use AI to help us further do things, and we have some AI tool now, and but I think those will get more, and I think it'll just be another thing. You know, I can't imagine 4 creatives sitting in a room yelling at an AI and getting the movie they want.
No, but
No.
maybe for stuff like you mentioned before, like okay, for day for night you get a roto. Maybe that roto maybe done by AI or at least 95% of it, and then you clean it a little bit. I think that that's gonna be something that's gonna happen soon if it's not happening already, or maybe matching 2 shots. Okay, this is the key shot. Just help me match the rest.
Yep.
But at the end
And
of the
I've used
day,
it so far. I've used it exactly like you said, where
yeah,
you know people are like, "Oh, they're really backlit, but we really want to see into their face." And you know that old paradigm where the director comes in and goes, "I want everything backlit, and I want a lens flare and everything," and then that's what the cinematographer does. And then when they're at it, they're like, "Man, I can't see their faces, and there's a lens flare everywhere."
yeah. Now clean the lens flare and bring that face up. Yeah, classic.
Oh
So
man.
yeah, I've used Runway
Oh yeah.
to use. I've done that, and you know it's crazy because the shot that I particularly did was on a beach, backlit, and it's something that if I rotoed it, if you said, "Hey, you know, how long is this going to take you to roto?" I probably would have said 10 hours. And in Runway, it probably took me 30 minutes and $10.
And then
And
it
that
just
was done.
outputs that tracking data or like the mask or whatever.
Yeah,
That
so it
you can then.
outputs a traditional mat that then I could put into the Resolve and
Cool.
use that. The other thing that's coming too that's kind of interesting is depth maps. That's another thing that we've been playing with a lot with AI, where it'll turn a shot basically into a black and white matte based on the depth, which allows me to, you know, brighten the foreground or darken the background, or sometimes create depth of field that wasn't, you know, there. It's like, you know, you have a lot of actors moving around, you shoot it in F11, but you know, you really want that look of it being wide open, but just couldn't get there the day of. And so that stuff I think is where we're gonna see AI really, I
Yeah.
think, take over. And I think the other thing too is I haven't seen it get there yet, but eventually that first pass I talked about where the images kind of come together and get consistent, I think eventually AI will get there where it can do that. But right now it's not there. They have some tools they're working on, but not there.
The depth mat tool, it's gonna help VFX guys to do, I don't know, fog in 2D and then give that 3D feel. So it's quick, effective, and cheap. But other than that, I don't think you're gonna be replaced anytime soon by AI. I mean,
You still need an
No.
artist on the other side of it to make those calls.
Correct.
Again, it's ChatGPT can write a book. Is it any good? You know,
Yeah.
you need somebody to say, "Here's the direction we're headed," and kind of guide the ship at least.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, everything we do on our projects is about taste, right? And about that developed taste that you've learned over the years and what works for a certain genre or a certain story. AI doesn't know that, you know. The best thing I've heard so far AI described as a blender, where it's like you're taking all this information and you're putting it into a blender and you're hitting blend and then you stick a spoon in and you come out with a mixture of everything. But that doesn't mean it's going to taste well or be right, you know. So I
When you
think
start mixing together colors, you just get brown. You know,
yeah, exactly.
you get mud.
Yeah. So we'll see where AI goes. I mean, there's definitely places where I think the VFX industry is going to be the place that it feels it the most. And just recently,
Animation.
animation as well. But I think, you know, there's also, at least for me, I love animation. And I want to see what guys can do that have original stories and original art. You know, if there's 3 guys that can make an original story that has the production level of a Disney movie, I'm all for it. Let's see it.
correct. Yeah.
But I think
But
that's one thing, we have to see is people getting back to their voices being heard and not being, so dependent on millions of dollars to do that.
Yeah.
there was a little bit of the same buzz when the video cameras became accessible and popular, and everything. No, now anyone is gonna make a movie. Wrong. Only
Yeah.
people with good ideas make movies, and the tool is not as important as the story. So, and it's
No.
gonna be the same thing. Uh, the artist, the storyteller, will remain, and yeah,
And then we're all
probably
serving that, right? If the script isn't good and the actors can't do the script, it doesn't matter how good the lensing is or how good the color is or how good the visual effects are. Nobody wants to watch it past a few minutes. But
correct.
we've seen plenty of movies with, good stories and maybe that other end of the filmmaking aspect that isn't done well. And people love it because they love the story and they feel the connection. And that's why AI doesn't scare me too much, because it's like if you don't have that human connection, people aren't into it. So,
Completely agreed.
but I
So,
have seen recently the where I've seen it in visual effects was I have a movie that I just finished that will be in South by Southwest, and it's an apocalyptic movie, and they had to put in some elements of that, abandoned cars and things like that. And the VFX guys told me that where they would have normally modeled 3D cars and they would have spent a month, building this world, they were able to generate elements in a day with AI, and then take those elements and kind of use traditional 2D compositing and clean them up and move it around. And they were able to do a really good job on not a lot of money, which, for the movie that it was, is what it needed. So
mm,
I think it'll be interesting, but it's not getting rid of us anytime soon.
yeah. So they didn't have that back when you started, obviously. So,
No, no. In fact, I started in visual effects. So I started in commercial telecine doing dailies and doing that. And I did a little bit of online at the time. And, these were the days when these rooms were $2 million, $3 million for all the equipment and didn't have near the capabilities we had. And then I got lucky that I got a job at Industrial Light and Magic, working for George Lucas. And the infancy of that when I got there, so we're talking like 1999, you're talking servers that were the size of refrigerators and frames that now are generated real time may take 36 hours to generate one frame. And so what would happen is we had these warehouses full of these refrigerator sized computers, these SGI silicon graphics computers. And what we would do if you had 40 frames and each frame was going to take 24 hours to render, well, you put one frame on 40 computers and it would take 24 hours to render. And sometimes in the early days, when you're pre-vising and you're just trying to see, we would step frame. So we'd only render every other frame and then duplicate it. So the motion would be a little bit steppy, but you would see the intention and see how things were working and the lighting and things like that. So, now you see what they can do with Unreal Engine, running real time. It's insane. But I think everything has its good and its bad. The thing that was nice about then was you had the time to really think about it, to really look at things, to look at references, and to kind of get those visual effects, thought about at a multi-stage level. Where now things are so fast, sometimes that gets missed, and sometimes I think that's why we get bad effects. But yeah, it was definitely a different world. I mean, at that time, when I first got in there, 2K was not even, we weren't even working 2K real time. We would render images down to 1920, 1080 at that time, and we were able to play off of some of those things. And when we went to actually doing DIs in 2K, that was, next level at that time. And at the time, we used a thing called the Quantel IQ, and that was a thing. That was an edit machine that we could conform the 2K scans, put everything together, and then use that as a playback and record source for the DIs. So we would play in 1920, 1080, and we'd be able to play real time and kind of color correct and do what we needed to. And then you would switch it into its 2K mode and hit record, and you would run at 6 frames a second. So when we would get done with a movie, a 2-hour movie was an 8-hour render. Where if you look at the resolve now, I can have layers of grain, layers of color correction, layers of noise reduction, and on a 4K movie, render it less than real time. 2-hour movie, it may take me 45 minutes to render. It's pretty insane what the technology has done. But
did you get started in, well, obviously, like working at Industrial Light and Magic, did you always want to be a colorist, or was there kind of this I started somewhere else and found myself here journey?
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing. So when I started in commercial world, I was doing a weird split shift. So I would come in for the first 4 hours of the day at 4 p.m. and I would help the online guys that were, Flame. There was Linear Bays at that time, and we were doing all the online, and I would help them finish till about 8 o'clock, and then at 8 o'clock, I would go over to Telecine and I would help with dailies. So I got this really kind of early start of where things were going, where I was not only working on the color side, but how to put that stuff together. And that's kind of what led me to ILM. And then at ILM, that was really like, we were really working on the infancy of DI. One of the first things we did there was Robert Rodriguez's Once Upon a Time in Mexico. And that was kind of one of the first things that was shot digitally, done as a DI, and then put out to film. And that experience I had before was really valid, where it was like I knew how to handle film, but I also knew how to handle all the digital images and move them through that pipe so that they could do that. And at that time, our color science was very different. It wasn't quite nearly as good as we were doing. So I would help with things like wedge tests. We were still at that time, the main deliverable was still film. So we were, always recording back to film and looking at what the film was going to look like, and coming up with, that's the original place that a lookup table started. It was just a digital approximation of what the film was going to look like, but they weren't quite accurate because you had so many analog processes going through there. You had the lab, how the lab was doing their soup, and what lab it went to. Some labs had higher degree of the chemicals so that they could run their chemicals a little longer. That meant more contrast in the image. It also, the strength of the chemicals, in those days, they were changing the baths pretty often because they were running so much film, and that would change the look of it. Whether you were on day one of a new bath or you were on day 7 of an old one, that would change it drastically.
That very well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I got this really good middle ground early that kind of helped me jump into DI. And then, ILM was the pinnacle. Obviously, we were working on Star Wars, Attack of the Clones, and into Revenge of the Sith. And at the same time, there was Minority Report and AI, and we were doing Signs. And so there was all these like things going on. And I got to take a lot of that experience of what was going on and seeing what those guys were doing. And we had all the high-end technology because it was all these big movies at the time. And so when I came to LA, I had and started working at Company 3 in the DI department there. I had a lot of experience in all these different areas that helped tie it together pretty well.
Nick, what the thing that it's more interesting to me about you guys, the colorists, is the artistry that you guys add to the movies. But that it's very difficult to level how much is your input as a colorist in the color or on the look of the movie. What would you say about that? What do you think what's your input? And probably every DP is different, every director is different. But what would you say that what's the colorist impact on the final product?
I think it varies on every project. Like on some big movies, you don't land up always adding very much because some stuff is done so well. But then on some smaller projects, you may save the day and save the movie, because it's moving so fast and there's so many things. So it really varies, which is another interesting thing of people who judge color. I'm a trained colorist and, I've been with all the big colorists in the world. And sometimes I can look at an image and I couldn't tell you where it started and where it ended. And so, I think a thing with colorists and judging colorists is you should look at the consistency. That's a colorist job, something you can see. The overall style and how it fits the story is another thing. But it's very hard to tell. And I did this thing a number of years ago with a group of people that came in for a tour, and I had 2 images. And I had one image that I just had applied a LUT to, and I had another image that I had done 16 layers of stuff to make it, workable. And so I show them these 2 images and I say, what's better color? And they all pointed to the one that didn't have any color on it. They're like, we love that. And I said, okay, that has no color on it. It's literally just the LUT. And they were shocked. And then when I showed them the other thing that looked relatively normal, still looked good, but relatively normal, and I showed them all the things we did to get there, they were so surprised. And I said, it's very hard to tell what a colorist does to an overall image in that sense. And so, the artistry, I think, is something that you just take from the negative. I could look at what you shot and kind of see how you're going and see what contrast you had, and kind of start working that. So I definitely think it's a wide range of projects where I'm like, I have touched every frame of that and manipulated everything. And then there's other ones where sometimes we say, well, it fell off the truck that way. I think that's another thing when people judge colorists. You see these high end colorists, and people are like, wow, their work's so amazing, and it's like, well, it is, but they're also working with the 1% of productions that have that level of care, and so it's hard to tell. I don't think you should judge. And then the other thing too is budgets. Some movies I've graded in 3 days. Some days I've graded movies in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And so I think without knowing the story behind things, sometimes it's really hard to know, what went into it. I think cinematography is the same way, right? It's sometimes you may just get there in the right light at the end of the day, and it's just the magic that you captured. And then there's other times where you spent 5 hours lighting and moving to get to that same place. So I think the biggest thing is that just the audience doesn't feel any of that they're just in that story. They're watching the movie and not thinking about it.
Absolutely. Seamless. Yeah, icing on the cake instead of, here's my fingerprint.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, this is something, I talk to DP buddies all the time. I think everybody questions it the same thing about themselves. Do you feel like you have a style when it comes to color? Are there things that you gravitate towards quite frequently that you're kind of like, you know what? I see too much of myself there. Time to go back to the script? Or...
Yeah, I definitely gravitate more natural than I do, what I would say is colorized, where you see it and it looks like you've done, looks like a grade is on it. We see those movies, a lot of the action movies and things like that. So I think my style leans to a little more natural, which is why I always love to work with DPs, because they always push me into an area that maybe I wouldn't have gone. Or the other thing I think is learning when to stop too is another thing with style. So I tend to not go too far. I kind of stick on the natural side. I like old movies. I like things that are pretty natural and feel like a normal world, unless there's some reason for the story to tell you otherwise. So yeah, I think for me it's mostly about keeping that natural skin tone, making people look like people, making things even, and just keeping the contrast. I like high contrast without it feeling like it's high contrast. So that's always the other thing. The other thing I try a lot is color separation, keeping the colors feeling like, even if you shot in a room with a lot of warm light, sometimes taking that and adding in some cool tones and just kind of helping it feel warm but having some separation, so everything doesn't feel red and your whites feel clean, or not as warm as the skin tones. And so so I think that's it, just leaning towards that natural area.
Nice.
Does normally people approach you with a very clear idea, or what's the balance between, Nick, here's the footage, help me out, or do whatever or give me your take on this one, versus, okay, this is the footage, don't touch it, just polish it?
I think everyone wants to experiment. I think everyone wants to see, like, if you didn't know anything, what would you do? And so I think that's always a thing. And like, Wami and I have done so much together, he knows. Usually when he walks in the room, I have 5 options for him. I'm like, hey, I thought of this, but then I wasn't sure, and I did this, but then I did this, and it's always that thing. I think we always say everything looks good until I show you something that looks better.
Exactly.
And that's the color base. So you always kind of are experimenting to get there. I think most people are into that. Sometimes they're, like I said, it's the cinematographers are always into that. They always want to see, well, what's this? Print it down a stop. Let's see what it looks like. Mm-hmm. It's usually the directors and producers that are a little more apprehensive to play with that image, partly because it's not their job to, I think. So they're a little more scared to see it change, where we're more like, let's dig in. Let's mess it up. Let's dirty it up. What's it look like if we go 2 stops down? What's it look like if let's fog out the shadows and see if that's the right way, and what's it make it feel, and does it work better? And so I think a lot of people are into it.
Does that, speaking of, I'm just picturing certain scenarios where you've got some politics going on maybe in the color bay between the people writing the checks and the, you know, the DP and the colorist and the director, does it ever get kind of a little rock and roll where you're playing mediator?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. You are definitely half your job is therapist and referee, and you know, there definitely is a lot of times a push and pull. You know, some teams though it's not that way. You know, and some teams are two ways. They're either on a unified front and they work together, or there's a lot of directors that are like, here, go do your thing. Let me know when you guys think you're done, and I'll come in and then I'll just push it in a different direction or just add my little touches to it. So it varies. Every production's a little different. I think that's also too the cinematographer colorist relationship. Is kind of that same thing. Like Wami and I had very similar tastes, so when him and I work together, it's super easy because I just do what I like and it's what he likes. And I think that's another thing with cinematographers and colorists. There's a ton of great colorists out there now. And I think it's just about finding that person. Like when Wami says, this is too saturated, I know exactly what he means. I know exactly where he wants to go just because we have that same taste and we work together a lot,
Oh, do you remember one day we were working on a movie that hasn't come out yet called Shadow Force. And like on the third or fourth day on the grading, I had a crisis. And I'm like, Nick, I don't see it. I don't see it. This is not the right way. We have to start over. And Nick goes, okay, I'm gonna show you different LUTs, different gradings, and just tell me what you feel like it's the right direction, and we go from there. So he goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, and no, 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 and then the 11th, I go like, that is exactly what I want. And he was like, that's our LUT. That's our movie.
Yeah.
So
you needed to see options.
I had like a faith crisis in that moment. I was like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And suddenly it was like, that's it. That's exactly it, Nick. It's like, yeah, that's your
palate
movie.
Cleanser.
Yeah.
Yeah. Palate cleanser to taste it again. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, the politic thing is always tough because you're always trying, like, I always want to protect the cinematographer's work and I want the director to be happy. And most of the time they're on a unified page or they work together well. Usually we're fighting a studio. That's usually where, it's usually filmmaker versus studio, which can get tough. And as a colorist, it's really hard because sometimes after the filmmakers leave, the studio comes back. And that can get really tough. And I've dealt with it two ways, where you're just in a situation where, you fight and you fight and you fight for the filmmakers. And that sometimes can lead me to be in a bad position with the studio because they look at me as being the difficult ones. And then there's some times where you just have to tell the filmmakers, look, I've done my best and I just have to appease the people that be. But I think those are very rare cases these days. I don't think that that's the norm. I think most of the studios will give their little notes to feel like they've, done something to it. But I think for the most part these days, everyone's kind of getting together on the same page. Shot Deck has helped that a lot, with having so many reference images. But you see that kind of used wrong sometimes, where someone will give me a style book in the beginning and they'll be like, this is the style, and you open up the page and there's 20 different levels of contrast or 20 different images and the color is different and every saturation's high here and low here and this one's crushed and this is hard lighting and this is soft lighting. And so sometimes you have to kind of go like, okay, well, what is it about this? And you kind of have to figure out what is it about all of these images that these filmmakers are looking at and feel like it's their movie, because it may not just be that contrast level. And so it's finding that kind of middle ground and making everybody happy. That's the end of the day why I like color, actually. The biggest thing, I love what I do. There's a lot of things that are hard. People can be hard, as I'm sure you guys know from on set. Sometimes people are the hardest challenge. But the biggest thing is I'm looking for is just to make people happy, just to make it better, make them help get what they want and have that final moment where we're all just hugging and can't wait to see each other on the next one. That to me is the fun of color is that collaboration. And also sometimes it's like I said before, it's like I may think this way and someone comes in and pushes me another way. And then I've learned a creative thing and learned a creative tool. And I'll take that with me every time from this movie to the next movie, Here's a little trick I learned from so-and-so. And, so it's good like that. It's really good.
That's the fun of it, man. These creative careers is like constant improvement, experimentation. Like nobody wants to do the same thing over and over and over again.
And constantly learning, right? You're
Yeah.
constantly learning, you know. Lenses are the thing I'm always trying to learn about because that's, I feel like, so important these days now with uh, every camera is so good. I mean, there's ones that are better than others, but you know, I hadn't done anything with a red cam in a long time, and my impression of a red cam was oof. And then the new one, you know, one of the newer ones I did, and it was gorgeous. It was beautiful. But the lenses they chose is what was really driving the style that they were capturing. And so I'm
Mm.
always trying to learn about what are those? Oh, those are the S4s. What is that? What is the Master Primes doing? What is that flavor? What is that? And then trying to help that carry into other cinematographers too. Like, you know, I'll get calls and they'll be like, what do you think of this? It's like, oh, it's really sharp. We can do something about that later. But if you don't want it to be really sharp, maybe you should look at something else. And vintage lenses, I think, are great sometimes because they do help that sharp kind of digital photography, but sometimes their imperfections can become crutches. And so you have to find that perfect balance of like, well, I like how it degrades the image, but it's not going to be a problem later, you know?
Can you, Nick? Can you talk a little bit about the conversation lately, which is the HDR copies, HDR deliveries, where everybody's like,
Yeah.
I don't like HDR. Every DP hits the HDR, and I think that as as we were talking about the AI, it's something that we gotta learn how to work with, and it's just you don't have to deliver at 1,000 nits. You can just lower it down, and then
Yep.
and then we're back in business. But how what's your feeling about the HDR grading and deliveries?
Yeah, so I think it's HDR is great. I think it's like a lot of things, it can be used wrong. I can speak from my personal experience. The first couple things I did in HDR were, if I look back at them, they were atrocious
Oh,
and
oh,
they were terrible because what I kind of always talk about is like when surround sound came out, you know, everyone was zooming everything around the theater, right? And it was that old Jurassic Park line, like everyone was so enamored with the fact that they didn't think if they should. And I think that's the way HDR started, with everything being so bright and having so much, just looking so different than what we're used to than traditional filmmaking. So I think with HDR, you kind of have to figure out how to use it in a much smaller capacity. Like just because you have 1,000 nits doesn't mean that you need to. You know, I would say most of the HDR we've done is probably in that 200 to 300 nit range, where if I showed it to you and you looked at it, it would feel like SDR, but just looks better. And, you know, HDR brings in some different challenges where sometimes you see things that you wouldn't in SDR. So that's another challenge. HDR can be great in a horror movie if you want to see into the shadows. If you don't, it can be a little tricky because the thing that people don't realize about HDR, it's not just about brightness. It's also about contrast ratio. And because it is brighter, you can see into the shadows if you want a little bit more. You can run something darker and see into it a little bit more than you would in the SDR, which sometimes for horror movies is amazing and sometimes it's not. So it's really, I think, about like HDR, just like thinking about your traditional filmmaking, thinking about what people are used to, and kind of, you know, sticking to that and just turning it up a little bit. And then you get something that's better than what you're used to, but isn't completely different. Now, maybe if your story is you're in, you know, space and, you know, you're doing something disorienting or something like that, you could go to 1,000 nits and have the star fields going crazy, and that would help your story. Or if you're doing sports or things like that, of course, you can get pretty crazy with it. But I think for a traditional narrative world, it's kind of sticking to the palette that we're used to and just turning it up a little bit and getting a little bit more out of it, you
The,
know?
the thing is that, at least in my case, is what I started hating HDR. It was like, oh, I'm shooting with this contrast, and I know what it's in that shadow. I don't want to see it, and then suddenly I go to the room, and it's like, what the heck? Why I'm seeing that corner over there when I didn't want to?
Yeah.
So it took me a minute to understand that, as you said, we don't have to use the whole 1,000 nits. We can work on 100 nits or whatever, and then. So, what would you say that for the people who shoots with SDR monitors and want to keep that look? What will be the level to work on the HDR copies? Is it 100 nits? Is it 200 nits? What is it?
Yeah, it's probably in that 2 to 300 is I would say where most of us are. That's and then it may change. You may have really crazy highlights that'll go higher, but you don't feel it. I think it's just about trying to maintain that SDR look as much as you can in HDR, which is totally possible. You can use that 1,000 nits any way you want.
Yeah.
I did a movie and they were so worried about HDR that they kept making it darker and making it darker and making it darker. And I'm like, guys, we're really drifting from where the movie was. They're like, no, this is great. This is great. This is what we want. And in the end, when it finally hit iTunes and I turned on the SDR and then I turned on the HDR was actually darker than the SDR.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yeah. So I think it's just like trying to make those two things as close as you can without, breaking it is it. That kind of what I was talking about with color spaces, like making it where it's the same movie but just a little better.
Yeah, you don't have to use the full paint palette. Yeah. Uh,
No. The other thing with HDR that I think, people have to get used to too is most HDR now we're doing with Dolby Vision. And so a lot of people may not know what that fully entails. And when you do Dolby Vision, um, you start in HDR, you grade in HDR, and then there's basically an analyzation process that happens that then makes your SDR from your HDR, right? And what happens with that is then sometimes you have limited controls over that SDR. And so that's kind of a creative decision on what you're going to worry about. Are you going to worry more about what the SDR looks like? Or are you going to worry more about the HDR? I'm still in the world that we should focus more on SDR because I believe that most people are looking at SDR. So if you've got, in that system, you've got these two things, and if one needs to be compromised, I always lean towards compromising the HDR a little bit. And usually what that means is maybe the HDR you're going to see in the blacks more because the SDR is going to be a little bit more contrasty. So, that's kind of the take where if I put in the HDR, I put the shadows right where you want. The SDR may be too dark. And so with the trim tools, you can't always get it out and get it to where you want. So sometimes you compromise one to get the other. Wami and I always start in SDR. We always start on a projector. And then from there, we'll take it. And so once that look is set, I just then will replicate that as best as I can in all the different versions.
Nice. Going back to the
Yeah.
lens thing, which is obviously something that we love as DPs. You're always constantly testing and trying new things. Do you find you read stories about, I don't know, just throughout some titles like Mindhunter, or do you find yourself in the color bay trying to emulate and kind of do some VFX type tricks, or do you is that left up to other departments?
No, it definitely is. I mean, the one thing I'll say that's probably universal for all colorists is that we're always the end of the line. So there's always that thing that they forgot, or that thing isn't good enough, or that thing that came up last minute, and they're like, "Can you do that?"
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. And usually, most of us have somebody on the side that's a VFX person, or sometimes our editors are pretty savvy at VFX, and they can do that too. But we definitely do. I do a lot of beauty work that over the last number of years has become kind of a specialty of mine, where I'm doing a lot of, eye cleanups and forehead cleanups and skin cleanups, and that can be tricky too. It tends to be pushed further in the color bay because it's a little more real time than VFX, where VFX artists definitely have more control over that than the colorists. But yeah, we do all kinds of things now, paint things out. I do a lot of sometimes multi-layer imaging where I'm maybe putting things on to give different textures. We talked about the grain, compositing log grain on a log image. I usually do that, and then chasing it through the whole pipe. And so they're not really VFX, but they're not really color. They're kind of somewhere in the middle. A lot of times when it gets into heavy tracking, you need to go to a VFX artist. They have the tools for that, and we don't.
Yeah.
It used to be like replacing Sky was VFX, and now it's just only exclusively you guys pinching it
Yeah.
and
Two
just
two
changing.
clicks. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're getting more and more of that. I think that's what's going to happen with AI is we'll be using those tools to do more and more of that. And I mean, if you saw what they do on Mad Max, in the color bay, it's VFX level most of the time, But the other thing is for that type of production, they're anticipating that and they're building it into their schedule. That becomes the hard thing. And then sometimes that's the other fight with VFX type stuff in the color room, where it's like, we've got 40 hours to do this project and we're supposed to be doing color, but now you're spending 6 of that doing these VFX and something's going to suffer. And so I
Yeah.
think that's the big thing where, you either have to give the colorist a little more hours or you have to accept that someone else will do it while you're, focused on that. And I always say, like, a typical movie maybe will have 1,200 shots. It's like, I have 1,200 shots to focus on and make them the best they can be. Why don't we have a VFX artist focus on these 5 things? And I think too, there's also a mentality when, if I say, hey, this shot's going to take me 3 hours, people are like, well, why? I don't get it. This should be done quick. And when a VFX artist says, oh, it's going to take 3 hours, they're usually like, okay, great. And I
Yeah.
think some of that is because they sit with us in color. And so they're sitting there for that. You feel that 3 hours, where in VFX, it's like, we sent that off before lunch. We came back from lunch.
Out
and
of
that
sight,
shot's
out of
done.
mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Something
For
that's come a
sure.
long way lately that I've been seeing, and I've been eager to mess around with it as far as a workflow speed thing, is there's probably a few programs, but like Scatter or something that emulates diffusion or fog in the
Yeah.
post realm, so that
Yep.
we're constantly, changing strengths based on the focal length and all that. I'm
Yep.
like, oh, that'd be interesting if it's really there to just like, hey, Nick's going to do that later,
Yeah.
you know?
I got into using Filmbox, which is made by the same people as Scatter, and that's got some amazing things in it. I've gotten into using that for grain, even though I love grain. I mean, traditionally, I use real grain, so I use gray cards that were shot on film and scanned, so we use that real grain. Where I've been substituting Filmbox in is when something's really dark and they want grain in. In real grain, you wouldn't see it because it's below the exposure. Like, grain is middle gray, right? So it'll disappear. And you get in these really dark scenes and people are like, I can't see the grain. And with real film, you can't kind of drive it. But with some of these, with Filmbox is probably my preferred one plugin, that you could go in and kind of move the range of where the grain is going in. And so you can get these really dark images that still have this like really, really strong grain. And but the plugins are becoming amazing. They've always kind of been what I called the screen door effect. It always felt like, here's my grain, here's my movie, and I'm looking through this thing, and
Yeah.
that was always hard. And that's one of the reasons why I like compositing grain on the log image first, because then it's like, if we're driving color into the shadows, I'm driving color into the composited image, not into the image and then taking grain and putting it on top. And so I think that
Yeah.
helps it feel real, as well. So, but there's so many great tools out there now. It's pretty incredible, some of the stuff we can do.
Isn't it funny that most of the DPs expend our film careers fighting the grain, and now our digital careers adding the grain that we were fighting before? It's
Yeah, yeah, it is. And we're putting back in what we used to fight and
in,
help it feel real.
about all the tools that we have now. When I started as a DP, DaVinci had a power window and it was square, and that was it. And you have to give the colorist the best negative possible and think about everything on set, because it was just one power window, no tracking, and not what you remember that we have to track frame by frame. And now, I mean, the tracking on the DaVinci or in any other color tool is freaking amazing. It can find
Pretty incredible.
6,000 tracks in the face. I mean, uh, do you feel that we have too many tools? Meaning that we used to work much more accurately before, and now because we have so many tools, we go like, okay, I'll fix it later. Let's keep going, something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think that I think it splits into two. I think there's half the group that wants to get it as best as they can. And I think there's the other group that knows what they can do and knows that they'll deal with it later. I think that brings up that same thing before of like, everyone falls in love with the offline and with the dailies, that can be tricky to try to get that stuff back in. I know that's one thing when we talk about grain that people are always like, can we add grain to the dailies so they get used to it? And it's a little harder in dailies to kind of do that level of compositing. But I do think, it splits down the middle probably. But I feel like a lot of cinematographers are still trying to get it on the neg. I've seen a lot of people going back to shooting the way film was shot, which is, underrating it and overexposing it a little bit. I think people have learned that, sometimes the highlights, you can really save those more on a digital camera than you can the low lights. And so, you may be rating something a stop under or a stopover, sorry, and doing it that way. So I think it's always a circle of traditions and fads.
Yeah.
We were in this high contrast phase of color where for 10 years it felt like everything was orange and teal and contrasty, and now I see stuff and we're going definitely more natural, a little flatter, a little less color. So there's kind of these trends that go through.
Yeah, you mentioned the red, the red. I've got a V Raptor sitting over here, and that's been the struggle lately. It's like it's so freaking clean, and I'm like struggling to get, So Wanmi will say it all the time. I love grungy, funky, vintagey, just to get some character, because it's like noiseless. I mean, you could shoot the thing at 1280, 1600, and you're at 8K. You bring that thing down to a 4K master, and it's like, okay, where is it? Where's the texture?
Yeah, Venice is like that. One thing with the Venice, I think the Venice is great, but it's got a little bit of that Sony video look to it. So the first thing I do with Venice is I blur the whole image. I just will take and soften the entire thing. And, people won't even know it. They'll come in and go, God, this just feels so much better.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just that sensor is great, but it's a little too sharp. Even when you have vintage lenses on it, it's sometimes too sharp. So you just got to knock it down, add some grain to it, and it starts to feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
I think we all just remember those images as kids and all the reason we fell in love with it. For some reason, your subconscious always harks back to those images,
Sure. I mean, when you go through Shot Deck, like you were saying earlier, I do this regularly just to browse, but the stuff that you gravitate towards, that I gravitate towards, like Seven and, all these different movies, when you actually put it up to modern films or things you've shot, you're like, oh yeah, no, it's just inherently softer.
Yeah.
Like you're like, it's lower resolution. They talk about the resolution of film, but some of those characteristics that we're trying to get back to. Yeah. Less perfect. See less in the shadows, all those things.
Plus film, a lot of times it would go through a dupe process, and that would cut the resolution in half sometimes. So by the time it got to a theater, you were really even seeing less. Mm-hmm. I've done some restoration projects lately where we've had to go back to negative and to IP. And the resolution difference between a negative and an IP is crazy different. It's the IP is so much softer than the negative, a lot softer.
So you do beauty work, which has become a big thing lately. I know you and Wanmi have done a ton of action films. Is there any category that you haven't, like that you'd like to dip your toe in?
Yeah, I would love to do a nature show. I would love to do like a Blue Earth or, something like that, where you're just like, the whole point is just
actual naturalistic
cinematography porn, I'll call it, where it's just about like making it the like most luscious, rich thing you've ever done. Sometimes I see those, and obviously they're always in these amazing environments. Like, go open a camera in the rainforest, you'll probably find some pretty interesting stuff. But every time I watch those, I just think, man, wish I could do one of these. So one day we'll do those. But I'm lucky I've been able to stay in the narrative world for so long, and I love it. I wouldn't change it. I love working on movies. I just love it. I love working with filmmakers. I hate doing remote. I want people in the room. I want to laugh. I want to play music. I want it to feel like we're in college making a movie at whatever level, that's what I love. I love that. So movies are where I love to be.
I think it's a big difference between being in the room and being remotely. I mean, it's at the end of the day you're working with another artist, and just that connection and that feeling, and even the off time that you spend just commenting on your children or how your family, and all that brings everything together better, I think. And maybe it's just a wish or a hope that I have, but I do think everything works better when you're with the colorist in the room.
I completely agree. And I think there's another thing too of like body language. It's like, I'm working through a scene and you're sitting next to me and I see you squirming, and we've worked together a lot. So I know you. I'm like, oh, he's uncomfortable. Like, okay, Wami, what's up? Like, I think you're going too dark. Okay. Or you need to push it further. Like, okay, I got it. So like that is a big thing too, because I think sometimes in remote, people may not say something, or not know yet, not even know, they're like, something's wrong, but I don't know. And I won't be able to pick up on that because I'm not in the same room, having that same experience with you. And then I think unless you're in a professional environment and it's been set up and you're kind of doing a professional remote, I think it's very hard to see the same thing, no matter how much we do. The iPad Pros, the new iPad Pros, the OLEDs are absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
They're amazingly accurate, and they match our professional $40,000 monitors amazingly. But someone will be sitting in a room like this with the lights on, and and it's a smaller screen, and I'm in a theater with a 30-foot screen, and looking at it in a different way, and it's just, sometimes I think it's just so much easier to be in person too. And the part I hate the most about remote is the posting remote, when you do a thing and you put it on Frame.io, and then you have no idea where they are, no idea what they're doing, and they just leave notes and come back. It's such a hard process, and something that may take 20 seconds for us to do in the room together may take 4 things of going back and forth. Well, no, it's too bright. Okay. Oh, now it's too dark. Okay. Well, now it's not enough saturation. And so those things in person are just so much easier. And I think you learn people's style and people's tastes so much better when they're in the room.
And excuse me, Alex, I don't know how other DPs work, obviously, because I'm not there. But to me, the most important part of the color grading is that day or two that we spend together talking about the movie. That's when the color happens. Yeah. Then after we find that look, and after we go like, okay, this is it, unless I don't have another crisis like the one we described before. But once that happens, it's just a very mechanical work, almost like you are matching shots, and the nuances are going to be minimum. But those couple of days where we're watching the movie together and talking about the movie and fine tuning the look, those are very important, and that is very difficult to do remotely. Because it's as you said. Just a comment or a gesture or like, I don't know, Nick. Remotely, it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think too. Experimenting wise, for me, it feels harder to experiment when you're remote. And I'm a person creatively that I need to see what's wrong so that I know what's right. My brain doesn't work in the way that I just know what to go to. So I want to, like if I'm doing an effect, I'll push the effect instantly way too far. And then I'll start pulling it back until I find where it likes. And color's kind of the same way, where sometimes it's like, I need to make 6 things I don't like to find that one thing I do. And I think that's harder in remote, because I think when people are on the other side, they're expecting to just open up this iPad, hit a button, and see this perfect thing. Oh, it's great, we're going, and when it's not, sometimes it can, well, is the setup right? What's going on? What is this? And it brings a shadow of a doubt into things. Unless you're in a controlled environment, like going from post house to post house is definitely much easier, when you're in the same 2 environments and you're seeing the same things. But just such a relationship business and such a team sport. It's like, try to shoot a movie with everyone remote.
It sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. It's just so much easier being together. So much more fun.
I'll go make widgets if we start going to that. I'll just go work in a factory.
Exactly.
If someone's not in the room or you're kind of left to your own devices, would you say that you tend to like push it a little more? Are you a little more conservative?
More conservative.
Yeah.
So usually what I'll do is I'll look at what people have been doing with the dailies, see what everyone's been using and looking at, and I'll use that as a guide. And so usually I'll push it a little further, whether it's contrast or color, but I won't go nearly as far as maybe we would if we were starting together and kind of finding it. So it definitely makes you, I think, a little more conservative.
Yeah.
But I think there's a thing too with, that's why you're directors of photography, right? Because you're directing us to that point. So, hopefully someone on the other end sees that and goes, no, let's crank that up. Let's do this, or pull back. Sometimes it's pulling back is the other way. I think the biggest talent and the biggest thing you learn from experience with color correction is restraint. I have a show that I do on HBO, Somebody Somewhere. And for 3 seasons, it was an exercise in restraint, because they wanted it to feel like a documentary. They didn't want it to feel slick. They wanted it to feel like someone opened up a camera and just captured these people. And it was always like, well, I could do this, or I could make it better this way. And it is a great looking show, but the whole style of that show lives in restraint, you know.
So, if you could choose a perfect setup for you to work with, what would you choose? Like, what camera, what kind of expo, what ISO? Like, if you could do, if I will listen,
Yeah.
what would you tell me?
Big if there.
I love the Alexa. I always find that I think the best images come out of the Alexa. I love the cooks. I don't know why, but there's just something always about the cooks that just sit well with my brain. So the other cameras are great. I don't think there's anything, like I said, they're all so good, but there's just always something with that. I love hard lighting. That's the other thing I think, is creating that contrast on set and not in the DI, I think is a big thing. I think that's like, kind of my two favorite things, the Alexa, the cooks, and just, pushing the lighting on set, I think is just so much more, because you can do things so much more on set than you can, digitally, it's especially if you want something contrasting, make it contrasting on set, because you can hone into those little tones with the lights where we can do it, but it's got a different feel to it than when you nail it with the lighting.
And obviously start with a lot that you created, right?
Yeah, and make a LUT that you created. One LUT is the other thing I will say. Unless there's a real reason, you should be able to shoot your movie with one LUT. Sometimes those people, day, night, it really the LUT shouldn't have to change between day and night. It shouldn't, unless you're building in some protection. Sometimes you'll do that, where they'll have the same flavor, but we'll build in a little more protection into the night LUT. But yeah, and when you have multiple LUTs, it gets really hard sometimes, because they don't get tracked with the systems, and you're trying to figure out, well, was this a different LUT, or is this the same LUT and just something they did on set? And but yeah, Alexa's king. Alexa is so good, and the Alexa 35 is great, and I've had really good luck with the textures that are in it.
Oh yeah,
those are doing really well, and but at the end of the day, I think it's about serving the story, right? Whatever works best. I know Wami and I, there was a project we were talking about where it was going to be sharp and electric, and there was a reason for that, and so I think it's always about that, always about what serves best to the story and what serves best for the audience.
I mean, yeah, you're intimately involved in telling that story. Have you, were there ever, or are there any aspirations to tell stories in a different fashion? Maybe colorist turned director, colorist turned playwright?
What's funny is I've been playing a lot with AI animation, because I've been playing around with that, and I've done some little short things that I haven't shown anybody yet, but I think I'm about to kind of dive into that a little bit more now. But yeah, I definitely want to play with that, because there's definitely that interest of being able to tell a full story by myself, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, definitely playing with that. But I think, right now it's just, my main focus is just diversifying as a colorist as well, especially with the changes in our industry that everyone's been going through, and doing more commercial work, doing more doc work, as well as all the narrative work that I always do, and just, serving those different areas, the best I can. They all have different needs. They all have different ways that they flow. A commercial color session will flow drastically different than a feature session, and kind of just learning how to live within those and make them the best you can be. Commercials are tough because for some reason they always cut out the cinematographers, and it becomes a leg lifting competition where the creative directors are like, well, I got to put my stamp on it. Well, now I put my stamp on it. Or, you have people that come in and go, well, who's commented on this? Because there's this political level, and I don't think that always leans to the best images. I think that's how you get these unnatural commercial images, where they've messed with the contrast, and they've windowed this and windowed that, and done all these things that you would never do as the cinematographer. So that's always tough, is kind of keeping them in check. But so it's a very different world than filmmakers, and docs are totally different. Where a doc is we had this guy, we could only interview him for an hour, we could only interview him in this 5 by 5 foot room that we couldn't light, and so that has a different challenge too. And that's where some of the AI stuff coming in works really well, where you can cut a person out in an interview and darken the backgrounds and get rid of the white walls and some of that stuff. So it's cool. It's a great way to exercise your brain. It's kind of like if you're shooting a romantic comedy, your brain's going to work different than if you're shooting a thriller. Just kind of learning how to use all those different creative influences.
Do you, from a colorist perspective, do you miss film?
No,
I suspected it.
no. I think we spent so much time fixing things, the dirt, the scratches. I mean, I still love film. I think it's great, but I think if you want that look, I know a lot of people now are doing this film record back where they're, doing a DI, shooting it to film, scanning it back in, and then going back and kind of like touching it up. But I haven't seen, at the end of obviously you have to have a lot of money to do that, but I haven't seen it yield something that I don't think you could get very close with digital. I think it's about experimenting and finding it, but film was great. It definitely was great, but I think it's, we've kind of moved beyond it. I think it also too opens up so many different possibilities with cinematography. Like even if you look at what they just did on, The Unknown, where he's shooting at 12,800 on the streets in New York with no real production lights. There's one light in front, you could never do that on film. You'd never get that. It would be, horrible. So I don't miss it.
Yeah, it's. I shot a movie at 6800 entirely, or 6400 entirely, and I found stuff that I will never find shooting film.
Yeah,
because you're going places that you will never go with film. So at this
it's
point,
a different language, right? It's a totally different language.
Yeah, with its pros and cons. But at this point, I think that we're so far into the digital that it's we know how to deal with it now, and I think that we're generally speaking, every DP is doing great images with digital. So there's kind of no need to go back to film now.
It's just so funny, like kind of ironic how like everything's so digital, yet we still do so many things to get back to a film look. And there's so many many times I work with a color, so I'm like, hey, I want a print look. I want a 2383, 5219, whatever base of colors. Do you, or have you in your past and in your career, do you work with a color science department or kind of backing where you're kind of dipping stuff off to, hey, create this look, give it back, let me tweak it? How does that go?
Yeah, I've worked with color sciences departments a number of times, and they always have a different approach. Some of them, they're always more technical than creative, which is, what they're there for. But I've worked with some amazing ones that profile film. They'll get charts on different stocks and profile that and give it to us. And so it's great, I think. But I think exactly right. It's always that harking back to the film look. We spent forever doing a Kodachrome look and getting that right, and an Ektachrome look. And color science departments that do that are great because they spend all that time kind of doing the hard work and then hand it to us to kind of help them tweak it and make sure it works. And then you have those as options, especially after you use them. Well, if I use this thing, this Kodachrome, I know what it's going to do. The blues are going to be perfectly primary. They're going to be very spiky. But if I use this Ektachrome or what was the one? We used an Autochrome one on something, which was just so different than anything else I'd done in a while. And so it's great with those color science departments. It's great to learn from them as well. They almost become your color management in a way that they're doing it. And I think it's the tools have gotten better inside the machines, but in the early days, they were the ones that were enabling us to do P3 projection and then HDR and then Rec 709 and have that all be contained, kind of in the same world. A lot of those tools are out there now and available in the software. And so, yeah, they're great. They're great tool to have. And any large company should definitely have at least one color scientist, and the smaller ones should definitely have some ones on call. And you could do it yourself, but they just kind of, color scientists expand that capability. And they also are great with working with the clients and making sure, because sometimes when you're a busy colorist, you're in session so much that you can't be on the pre-pro calls. And so it's great to have a color scientist that can handle that kind of stuff as well and be like, I was on this call and I think they're going to do this, and I tried to push them this way, but maybe you should call the cinematographer and have a talk. And you're like, okay, great, So it's an extra layer of safety as well. And I've worked with some great ones that have made EX, like one gentleman I worked with, Josh Pines. He was one of the guys that developed EXR, and so these guys also have this just technical depth that none of us as colorists will ever have because we just don't do that all day. And so they're great to have. Can't go wrong.
Is it really that we want to imitate those Ektachrome and Kodachrome looks, or we want to imitate the memory of those things? Because what happens most of the time, at least it happens to me and the directors I work with, we go like, okay, this is exactly how the Ektachrome will look like. And we'll go like, no, that's not what Ektachrome looks like. And is it, and I think it's because we have the idea, the romanticized idea of what the Ektachrome looks like, and then it doesn't work for your project, or it doesn't work for that particular, or maybe the lighting we do now, it's different, it's more, I don't know, the tools are different, so when you go like, boom, Ektachrome, it goes like, I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's always a starting point. I think it's like, let's look at what the flavor of these stocks do, and then it probably will do some things we don't like, and then we'll change that and we'll rein that in and fix that. So I think it's kind of like that. But you're definitely right. And one of the things you said, 7, you brought up 7 earlier, Alex. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's funny is people remember 7 a certain way, and what they forget about that movie is that most of the look of that movie is production design and art design. The colorless nature of that movie, and that, yes, it's bleach bypass, so that gives it a certain thing. But the main feel of that movie is how they dress them and what they are in set. And there's the whole thing for a long time where Brad Pitt's always in gray and his counterpart is always in beige, and the sets are always drained of color. You can't make that in color correction, And so people have that memory of what it looks like and think they're going to come into a color bay. The other opposite one is Wes Anderson, right? Wes Anderson's always a reference where people are like, I want this to feel like a Wes Anderson movie. And it's like, well, you didn't shoot it like a Wes Anderson movie. Mm-hmm. So it's no matter how much I turn up these colors, no matter how much knobs I twist and turn, we're never going to get there because you didn't capture what that art direction and that production design and the costumes that happens on set is, So that's, but they remember it a certain way,
sure.
Like you said.
But it's so, I mean, because you look at those and you look at the skin and the humans, you're like, oh, the humans look right. And it's everything else that you have to, because if you're just crank it up, then skin starts going nuclear and, yeah. So
or you break it into secondaries and you start like keying things and then it becomes unnatural. Wild. Yeah, then it becomes unnatural and it doesn't look good. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. But 7 was recently remastered in an IMAX.
Yeah, January the 3rd, they projected on IMAX.
I know, you sent me tickets.
I had tickets and I was 6,000 kilometers away. I couldn't go. And I remember half an hour before the screening. And Alex!
You sent it to me and I'm like, I got to put the kids down, man.
It was sold. It was funny. I went to try to see it here in LA and I thought I could just go buy a ticket and it was sold out.
Yeah.
I kind of was happy about it. I was like, oh, I'm glad that movie could still sell out a theater.
Oh, yeah. I bought tickets like 3 months in advance. It was like, okay, January the 3rd, 2 tickets for me and my wife. We'll go for dinner, then 7 on IMAX. I mean, it's a perfect date. Yeah. And like half an hour before the screening, it was like 2 in the morning. I was like, oh my God! 2 in the morning in Europe. Like, oh my God, Alex, do you want to go to?
Yeah. So, I wish, man. That's one of my favorite films of all time.
Yeah, dude.
No, it's definitely high up on my list as well. For a long time, I had a still gallery with just stills of it, so that when people would come in and go, I want it to look like 7, I would pull it up and go, this is 7. Like that thing, you're like, well, you remember it like this, so let's look at it so you can actually see what it is. It's so great. It's
Speaking of that, and you know, along with your style of kind of enhanced naturalism and stuff, are there movies that you haven't colored that you frequently will go back to? Like just one that's like, oh my God, this is, I would love to have colored that film.
Yeah, I mean, I love Prisoners.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
I think it's this like juxtaposition of like beautiful cinematography in this mute kind of ugly world. And that to me is just like, how do you make something so ugly look so beautiful?
Yeah.
I love that movie. I actually did a case study of like what was done in that movie, you know, and again, some of it's stuff in front of the lens, not the color, but like the way the practicals, you know, you have these environments where the production's just stripped of color, but then they put in these warm practicals everywhere, and it's just I love the way that movie looks. You know, that's definitely one that I reference a lot. No Country for Old Men is another one. Some of those vistas, the way they did the landscapes and the colors that are in there, are just so good, so good, so good.
Two good ones.
Yeah,
man, I'm gonna revisit Prisoners now. I don't know if I can get Kristen to watch it, but
it's
not tough, especially once you have kids.
It's
very
brutal.
tough.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
Yeah, my wife won't sit through anything that has anything bad happen to a child anymore after having a kid. So there's like those movies come up. I'm like, okay, that one's for me. We'll wait for the next one for her.
Yeah, I just watched. I hadn't seen it. I can't believe it. I just watched the Northman Viking movie. It's got, I mean, just talk about brutal. And I was recommending it to Kristen. I was like, never mind. Don't listen to anything I'm saying. It's gorgeous and it's a lovely movie, but never mind.
So what's one movie from 2024 that people need to see? Oh, let's talk cinematography.
The Brutalist.
The Brutalist? Yeah.
The Brutalist is,
I haven't seen it.
It's a
I haven't seen it yet either.
Very interesting movie.
Yeah, that was they shot VistaVision, yeah?
Yeah, not all of it, but yes,
Yeah.
most of it, I think. I saw a 70mm copy in a good screen, and it was very interesting.
Very good.
A movie that I always use as a reference that you made, it's Nebraska. Every time I work on black and white, that's one of my go-to kind of look. Have you worked on black and white again since, or?
I just did. Yeah, I've done a couple little things. I haven't gotten to do a full feature in black and white. Black and white's such a hard thing to sell to people, so it takes a very brave group to actually do black and white. I've done some music videos and some short form things, but I haven't had a chance to work on a feature that does black and white like that. And that was shot color, so that was an interesting process of, when you shoot color, you can't just desaturate it, because what you land up with is very video looking. So what you land up doing is taking the RGB channels and mixing them together. And when you mix the RGB channels together, it's kind of like when you would do black and white photography and you put a yellow filter or a green filter or a blue filter, how you could kind of change the contrast and what was coming up. And so that's really, really fun. But yeah, it's very hard to get people to want to do a black and white movie. I'm always joking about that. I'm like, we're doing this black and white, and everyone laughs. I'm like, I'm serious, but I guess not.
I worked on my last 2 commercials in black and white. Surprisingly,
it's such a different thing to color too, because you could do things that you could never do. Like I can just take a power window and drag it across the whole screen and do something to it that you could never do in color because you would see.
Yeah.
But in black and white, it just becomes a tonal variation. It's a different medium, and I actually think that's one place HDR I really think looks great. Black and white HDR looks amazing. It looks so good. Because sometimes in SDR it still feels a little gray, or the monitors will have a little bit of an influence. So you'll be like, it feels a little green or it feels a little blue, but in HDR it just comes alive.
Why?
I've had a couple. I think because you're able to get the peaks higher, and you just spread out that gray chart over a little more, so you feel like the whites feel whiter, and the tonal range, there's just more tonal range there for you to play with. It's pretty cool. It's very cool.
In HDR, is there a perceptual thing that you've noticed where as the whites get whiter, the blacks feel darker as a weird visual trick?
Yeah, I mean they will be, just because of the contrast. You're making the contrast higher by moving the top, rather than the bottom. So yeah, they'll feel a little deeper. The contrast will feel a little harder. For sure.
Yeah, I've had no projects finished in HDR, so I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. And it's funny, a couple things I have done in black and white, we always go back to Triax. I think everyone remembers Triax,
Yeah, well, I bet that's a constant reference, right, for black and white.
Well, and how many of us that shot stills shot Triax? Most of us shot it at some point, even if it was in film school.
Yeah.
You start off. such a beautiful stock.
I shot a lot of Ilford because it was British negative, and I grew up in Europe, so. But yeah, Tri-X was a
Agfa too? Did you get into Agfa?
no, not that much, not in black and white. I worked on a movie with Agfa film in a film.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I never heard of anybody working with Agfa film since. This was 1992 probably, and I don't exactly know why the DP. I was a focus puller then, and I don't exactly know why the DP chose to work with Agfa. But
So you
yeah.
had other options at that point.
Oh yeah, Kodak. I mean,
Yeah.
the obvious,
Yeah.
at least in Spain in that time, it was Kodak was the obvious choice. Fuji made a comeback a little later, and we used a lot of Fuji, especially when I studied as a DP in the early 2000s. There was a lot of Fuji around. But Agfa, I don't exactly know why we shot a film in Agfa.
Just
Yeah.
because.
Yeah.
It was German, so probably it was cheaper. I have no idea.
Oh my gosh.
Somebody had it, bought it for another production, and it was left over. What do you find, Wami, being from Spain? What do you see between the American cinematographers and more the European cinematographers? Do you see a difference in where they're going with the craft?
I don't know, dude. It's a very interesting question. I always been a big fan of American cinematographers and the American look of the movies. And weirdly enough, I always felt that when I was I don't think I shoot different when I shoot in Europe or in America. But I always convinced that when I shoot in America, my images are better. And I don't know if it's something that is pure suggestion, or what, or it's just that every piece of the process is a little better, and then when you put all them together, it's completely better because I don't change.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't expose differently in Spain than in the U.S. Or it may be that I mean, some of my favorite DPs are not American. Like El Chivo is not American. Roger Dickens is not American. I mean, there's many DPs from all around the world, all shooting in America, and I love that. That's kind of the look that I like. I don't know what.
Yeah.
But
What leans to getting there? Yeah. But
Yeah.
that's
yeah,
There's so many great shows coming out of Europe.
there are.
Um,
There are, especially from England, some from Germany, amazing, and France. There are really, really, really good looking shows coming from Europe. So
Korea.
Baby Reindeer
And Korea.
was one.
yeah,
Korea as well.
Yeah.
What was the other one? The Gentleman. The Gentleman was.
the gentleman is
one
really
that
good.
came
Yeah.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah. There's some very good things coming out of Europe right now. I'm a big fan of Gomorrah, which is a little older series, but that was one of the ones where I'm like, oh man, they didn't make it slick and they made it kind of ugly. And
Gomorrah, the
kinda
Italian one.
yeah,
That's ballsy. That's ballsy looking.
yeah,
series.
yeah, exactly. That's what I love about that.
Yeah.
It's like they, green. They just let it be ugly and let it hit the skin tones and just let it not worry about the actors looking so perfect and it leads to the story, of course. But I see when I look at things, I think I see a lot of more bravery over there than some of the stuff we're doing here, which is interesting.
I think there is a big part of you mentioned earlier maybe less invasive producers or a little bit more respect on the creative side. It's like, okay, the director wants it like that. That's how it looks. Against maybe there's in America producers are more invasive, or I don't know, but there is a little bit. There are more ballsier or braver images coming from Europe right now. Yes, I think I agree.
Yeah.
Do they have
Good
the
to
same?
Do I need to stay here now or what?
No, you come back. You come to LA.
Yeah. No,
I think
we
it's
need you
just
back.
about different, right? It's like looking at that difference and then like trying to take some of that, into what works on whatever project we're doing.
Sure.
It's
I think a lot of
definitely-
people comment on American cinematography of lately as this kind of dark wave, right? Everybody trying to push and compete, and we've talked about it before. Shoot darker and dark. Who can shoot the darkest and still get an exposure?
Yeah.
I
But the
think,
cameras have done that, right? Like 2500 on the Venice, I
They've
remember everyone
allowed
would
you
come
to do,
in.
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, and then everyone would go, okay, I want to see more. And I'm like, well, it's too thin because all your ranges and your highlights. And, yes, you're
that's it.
seeing, and that's one thing I always try to remember with people who haven't shot Venice. I'm like, look, you're going to put it in that higher ISO, and yes, you're going to see into the dark. But remember,
Well,
whatever you
exactly. I
see
mean,
is
I
all you
think it's a
got.
very interesting bottom end to play with, but
Yeah.
you need to know what you're doing. I mean, you get what you
Yeah.
get, and you don't get upset.
Yeah.
So,
But I think it also comes, I think a lot of people who haven't done film don't remember, like, or they don't think that, like, you're out on a beach, maybe you want to be at 2500 and you want to ND down, and not everybody thinks that way. They're like, they put it the other way and they're like, well, we'll shoot at 400, and then it comes back and it's super contrasty and there's no highlights to it and
Yeah.
you can't save it, and you're like, well, and I don't know too many people that go the other way that are shooting in the dark at 400, but it definitely seems like, you got to figure out where that, as you shift that exposure or that sensitivity, where your range is and what you're looking at. Film was so good at that. You could go so many stops over on film and still save it in the bay. I mean, you could go 6 stops over, sometimes on the highlights, and it'd be like, oh, don't worry about it. There's something there, it's no problem.
yeah. Well,
Digital's not that way.
the other thing is that maybe you don't want to save anything. It's like, it's just, I'm not interested in anything that I'm not seeing
Yeah.
above or below. That's how I like it. So you don't need
Yeah.
you don't always need the entire range and protect for everything, because you don't want it. So
Yep. You're right. And that's where HDR gets interesting. Like, I've had productions where, like, they're lighting on set in SDR and the windows are blown out. And of course, there's a ton of production gear outside the window. And everyone's looking and go, great, can't see a thing. And then you go into the HDR and they're like, I can see the crew walking, I can see that
Yeah.
stand, I can see the light. And that becomes tricky because in order to get that same blown out look, you have to make it really bright. So we've got some better tools now that are helping us do that. But that's always a tricky thing where it's like, we never saw that on set. It's like, well, now we've got, 16 stops we're looking at on a monitor versus the 11, 10, whatever it is in SDR, So
Wow.
tricky.
When usually you're like, yeah, I just want 7. give me 6
There
or
was
7 stops.
There was a movie that I did that they're on a plane, and of course it's just on the tarmac, and in the SDR the windows are just blown out. That's the way they shot it, and they're actually backlighting through the windows on the plane as well. And then when we go to do HDR, you could see everything outside the windows. And so they actually had to go do VFX, and they went through and painted it all out and then came back because they didn't want the HDR to be brighter or to have any difference. And so
Yeah.
I think that was kind of a surprise. That's one good thing I think about monitoring on HDR, on set, is you could see that. But I think in general, HDR is just so unnatural that it throws off people's lightings. Every movie I've ever set up where they want to monitor HDR, by day 3 or 4, the HDR monitors are off the
it's
set.
off the
Back to
window.
SDR.
Yes, I did only one commercial on HD with HDR monitors, and it was like, never again. That's
Yeah.
I do what I do, and then I want to see what I do, and HDR or not, that's the look of it. Yeah.
We'll replicate it
Yeah.
later. Yeah.
So one advice for a kid who wants to be a colorist. What would you say to anyone that wants to be a colorist as a career choice?
Oh boy, that's so tough with these days. Ignoring the situation of the industry, I would say color everything you can, color for free, make relationships super important. Super important. Your relationships can be more important than your talent. So I would say, but just do it. Just the more you do, the more you'll learn, the better you'll get, and just keep going and going and going. Just don't think about it. Just keep learning. Always try something different. Always set up parameters. Sometimes with movies or shows, I'll be like, I'm not going to use these tools. I'm going to stick with these 3 or 4 things, and that helps define a look. I think I would just, that would be my biggest thing, is just color everything you can. Look at images, learn scopes. That helps. Take the images you like, look at them on a scope, see what they're doing, see where the reds are, learn what that is, and then replicate that, as much as you can. And also, don't feel like you always have to push everything so far. You know, sometimes cinematographer nailed it. They just need a little contrast and a little balance, and things are great. You know, it doesn't always have to be this 16 layers of grades and 5 power windows, and focus on the things you can control. Focus on your balancing, your contrast, your black levels. You know, one thing I do every movie is I go forwards and backwards through a movie, looking at the shadow level and seeing that every shot has the same value, so that your eye doesn't get taken out of it, and keep that look consistent. And yeah, just do everything you can. Low budget, high budget, whatever you could do, just get those images and put as many. You'll learn every project you do. You learn something new or some little twist, or that's what's exciting about it. That's what's fun. And hopefully our business gets to a point where it can support more young talent coming in. Make more movies.
Yeah, exactly.
Make more shows.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
But yeah, that's just go for it. Don't, and make relationships. So it's always easier working with people you know and having that repeat than it is, starting new every time. Yeah.
Okay, Nick, I think this is it.
All right.
Thank you so
That was
much
fun.
for being with us. We learned a lot, and I hope I see you very soon.
I hope to see you soon as well. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
Nick.
you.
Thank you.